"You were never one of us." That's what my aunt said, right before the lawyer opened the envelope. Right before my grandfather's face appeared on the screen, calm, clear, and about to destroy every illusion in that room. I had walked into that law office expecting nothing. Not an apology, not an inheritance, just the last page of a story no one let me write. They didn't flinch when I entered. They didn't ask why I came. Because to them, I was the leftover girl, the one who didn't belong, but my name was the only one in the letter he left behind. My name is Elena Ward, and if you ask my family, I was always the one who faded into the wallpaper. Not rebellious, not dramatic, just quiet, too quiet to matter, too quiet to be remembered. I didn't go to Stanford like my cousin Tyler. I didn't join the family company like Aunt Judith expected. I didn't marry someone with a name they could drop at dinner parties. I worked at a nonprofit that helped women find safe housing after leaving abusive homes. That didn't make it into the Christmas newsletter. But my cousin's dog spa franchise, full-page spread, I wasn't angry about it, not really. You can't resent people for failing to see you if you stopped expecting them to. I lived in a small apartment with creaky floors and second-hand curtains. The kind of place no one in the Monroe family would ever step foot in unless they were lost. But it was mine, and more importantly, it was honest. No pretending. No applause, just work, quiet dinners, and a borrowed sense of peace, until the silence was interrupted. Not by a phone call, not by a letter, but by a line in a trust document no one thought I'd ever see. They only remembered me when something needed cleaning. A hospital shift no one else wanted. A holiday errand that didn't deserve a thank you. A long weekend when Grandpa needed company and the others had spa reservations. Aunt Judith always said I was so helpful, but she never asked if I was happy. When Grandpa's arthritis flared, I was the one who refilled his prescriptions. When his eyesight dimmed, I was the one who labeled the jars in his pantry. Cinnamon, not cayenne. They said it was sweet. I said nothing, because I wasn't doing it for them. Grandpa never asked for much, but he never forgot to say thank you, not with words always. Sometimes just a warm hand on mine. Sometimes just a look across the garden, when the wind passed and he'd say, "See that? The roses still know who waters them." But to the rest of the family, I was barely visible. They never outright said I didn't belong. They didn't have to. The family portraits told me. The group texts that excluded me told me. The years of birthdays where no one remembered mine except Grandpa. They remembered me when it was convenient, but never when it counted. And when he passed, they didn't even remember to tell me he was gone. I didn't find out he had died from a phone call, not from Aunt Judith, not from Tyler, not from anyone who carried his last name. I found out from a bank alert. A routine email saying a trust account I had helped him set up, years ago when his hands still trembled over the keyboard, had been closed due to the passing of the primary account holder. No obituary, no invitation, no message. I searched his name online and found a short column in the local paper. Graham Elliott Monroe, 83, passed away quietly at home. Private service. Family only. Family only. 2 words that hit harder than any silence ever could. They buried him without me, without the girl who used to rub his hands when the joints ached, without the girl who still remembered the way he took his tea, strong, no sugar, splash of lemon. For days, I couldn't feel anything, just static, like the world had shifted 2 degrees left and no one told me. I didn't cry, not because I didn't care, but because grief needs a place to land, and mine had no invitation. Then, exactly 1 week later, a letter arrived. Cream envelope, no handwriting, just a wax seal with an unfamiliar emblem. Inside, a folded parchment from Langford and Hartwell, estate attorneys. Typed. Cold, formal. You are requested to attend the final execution of the Graham Monroe Trust. Tuesday, 9:30 a.m. Enclosed, address, code, time. That was it, no dear Elena. No condolences, no explanation. Just coordinates to a room full of people who once called me invisible. I stared at that letter for a full hour. held it under the light like it might reveal a second message, one that made more sense. Why now? Why me? Why invite the shadow they'd worked so hard to erase? A part of me thought it was a mistake. Another part, the quieter one that still remembered the smell of Grandpa's pipe tobacco and peppermint, knew it was. He wouldn't have sent for me unless there was a reason. Not for money, not for pity, just for something unfinished. So I went. Not with hope. Hope was a luxury I no longer carried. I went with a steady heartbeat, a pressed blouse, and the kind of silence that no longer apologized. They wouldn't see me coming, and that was the point. The law office sat in a refurbished brownstone, the kind with stone lions flanking the steps, and a door so heavy it made you second-guess if you should be there at all. Inside, it smelled like old money and older secrets. A receptionist in navy offered me tea I didn't take, then pointed down a quiet hallway lined with oil paintings and polite silence. "Conference room B," he said. "They've already arrived." Of course they had. Voices filtered through the door before I reached it, polished, measured, just loud enough to carry. Aunt Judith, commenting on the lighting, "Honestly, you'd think with all those fees they could afford better bulbs." Tyler laughing, "Grandpa always did prefer the dramatic. Must be why he made us wait this long." I stood outside the door for 3 seconds longer than I needed to. Not because I was nervous. Because I wanted to remember this moment, the breath before the breach. The quiet before the theater unfolded. Then I opened the door and walked into a room where no one expected me to exist. Judith's face pulled tight like a thread about to snap. Tyler's smirk froze mid-word. No one stood. No one spoke. Except her, my aunt, with a voice dipped in condescension and cologne. "Did someone send you the wrong address?" I didn't blink. "I received an invitation," I said simply, "from Mr. Langford's office." And then I nodded at the man seated at the head of the table. Tall, neat, silver-rimmed glasses, Mr. Langford himself, my grandfather's estate lawyer. His gaze met mine and held, unreadable, like he'd been waiting. Judith let out a sigh sharp enough to cut marble. I told them to take her name off the list. I took a seat without asking. The air tasted like old linen and new judgment, but I'd sat through worse. And this time, I wasn't here to disappear. Mr. Langford cleared his throat, not loudly, but with the kind of precision that rewrites the temperature in a room. "If everyone is settled, we'll begin." No one responded. No one needed to. The will had been printed on heavy paper, white with gold trim, like it belonged in a museum, rather than the hands of people who once forgot my birthday. He adjusted his glasses and began to read. It was expected. To Tyler Monroe, the primary residence in Marble Hill, the vintage car collection, and all remaining shares in Monroe Development Corp. To Judith Monroe, all liquid assets, retirement accounts, and artwork from the Charleston estate. To several extended relatives, golf memberships, heirloom jewelry, and commemorative silver. My name was not mentioned. Not even as an afterthought. A silence followed, then a chuckle. "Well," Judith said softly, smoothing her scarf, "I suppose that's everything." Langford didn't smile, he simply turned the page. "There is one final document." Judith's eyes narrowed. Tyler leaned back in his chair, chewing his thumbnail. A familiar nervous tick from when he was 8 and caught lying about broken windows. "This," Langford said, unfolding a sealed parchment, "was written separately from the official trust. It was delivered by hand, witnessed, and notarized 6 days before Mr. Monroe's death. And then, more quietly, he requested it be opened only after the reading of the main will." The room stiffened. Judith sat up straighter. "What sort of document?" Langford looked at me, then back at them. "A personal letter and a video file, both addressed specifically to Ms. Elena Ward." The room didn't gasp. It cracked. The envelope was thicker than expected. Sealed with a pressed wax emblem, Grandpa's initials curled like old vines. Langford opened it gently. His fingers moved like a man who had done this many times, but still understood when something sacred was about to speak. He unfolded the letter. The paper trembled slightly in his grip, or maybe that was just me. "To Elena, my shadow in the hallway, my morning tea companion." The only one who ever asked how I was sleeping, instead of what I was leaving. Tyler shifted in his seat. Judith exhaled too loudly. I know the will you just heard doesn't carry your name, and that wasn't by accident, but it wasn't by choice either. Langford paused. The room was still. Not with calm, but with calculation. Over the past year, pressures were applied. Signatures were presented when I wasn't fully awake. Questions were answered on my behalf by voices louder than mine, and I let it happen. I was tired. Not of life, but of noise. Judith leaned forward, tight smile frozen in place. He's confused. He was confused. Langford held up a hand, didn't look at her, kept reading. But confusion fades when silence is respected. Elena, you gave me that, week after week. You never asked what I'd give you, you just showed up, with ginger tea, with stories, with patience. My throat burned, so I left you something else. Not in the will they watched me sign, but in the file they didn't know I kept. Langford reached down and removed a black USB drive from a small velvet pouch. A video, he said quietly, recorded 2 weeks before his passing, with 2 witnesses, notarized, secure, and protected. Protected how? Tyler asked, voice suddenly sharp. Langford finally looked up. Encrypted, time-locked, set to auto-release to press and probate court. If anyone in this room attempts to contest what comes next. And for the first time since I entered the room, someone looked afraid. Langford inserted the USB drive into the sleek black laptop beside him. The screen lit up with a soft chime, and for a moment, all I could hear was breathing. Tight, shallow, waiting. Then the video began. Grandpa sat in his favorite armchair by the sunlit window. Wrapped in the old plaid blanket I once repaired when the seams came undone. He looked smaller, yes, but not frail, clear-eyed, still. His glasses were slightly askew and his hands rested on a leather-bound notebook. If you're watching this, he began, voice steady. Then the page has already turned. And I have one final footnote. He didn't smile. He didn't soften. This wasn't the man who slipped me sweets behind Grandma's back. This was the man who had watched his own legacy rot beneath polished surfaces, and was done pretending he hadn't noticed. Tyler, he said the name like a verdict. I watched you use my name to leverage a bridge loan, knowing full well the land it was for belonged to someone else. I saw the paperwork, the falsified clause. I paid the fine quietly to protect the company, but I never forgot. Tyler shifted, no denial came. Judith. He paused just once, then continued. You told people I was confused, that I didn't remember things. But I remember exactly when you took the authorization code from my drawer and used it to reroute the sale of my Charleston estate. Judith opened her mouth, but no sound followed. And then there's Elena. He leaned forward. You were never loud, but you were present. You asked nothing, gave often, and when I asked if you needed anything, you always said, I'm okay, Grandpa, just rest. You never asked for inheritance, but you earned the right to finish what I started. He held up the leather-bound notebook in his lap. Inside this is the original trust, a codicil signed by me, and witnessed again by people I trusted outside this room. Langford has the legal copy. The screen flickered slightly, then steadied. To Elena, I leave the Marble Hill residence, the development shares, the equity I built from nothing, because she's the only one I trust to build something better. His eyes softened then, just briefly. I don't want revenge, I want peace, and if any of you challenge this, Langford will know what to do. He sat back, folded his hands. The silence ends here. The screen faded to black, no music, no fade out, just stillness. Then Langford closed the laptop and said the words that turned legacy into consequence. The revision is binding. The transfer is already in motion. And just like that, I was no longer the quiet girl in the corner. I was the name no one saw coming. The room didn't explode. It imploded. Judith's pearls sat twisted at her collarbone. Her face, so carefully constructed, cracked at the edges. Tyler blinked too many times. The kind of blinking people do when they're hoping the world resets if they just keep their eyes moving. Langford began reading the codicil out loud, his voice as calm as ever. To Ms. Elena Ward, I hereby transfer full ownership of the Marble Hill property. all remaining stock in Monroe Development, and associated accounts held in my name or estate. Each word landed like a stone in water, and for once no one interrupted. Additionally, he continued, Ms. Ward is granted sole authority over the Monroe Foundation, with discretion to restructure, dissolve, or reassign leadership as she sees fit. Tyler's mouth opened, then closed. No sound. I didn't move, didn't gloat, didn't smile, because power like this doesn't roar, it whispers. Judith finally found her voice, brittle and unfamiliar. This is absurd. He must have been coerced. Elena doesn't even carry our name. Langford didn't flinch. He simply lifted a slim manila folder and slid it across the table. Medical evaluation, he said, dated 2 weeks before the codicil was signed, declares Mr. Monroe to be of sound mind and fully aware of all legal decisions. Judith stared at it, but she didn't reach for it. You'll never get away with this, Tyler muttered. The board won't follow her. Langford raised an eyebrow. The board has already received notice. Most of them replied within the hour, congratulating Ms. Ward. That was the moment, not the moment I won. There was no winning here, just truth finally allowed to speak. And in that moment, I understood what Grandpa had done. He hadn't just left me something. He had taken everything they built on hollow ground and returned it to solid earth. I didn't walk out of that law office victorious. I walked out empty-handed on purpose. The documents were sent to me later, signed, sealed, delivered, but in that moment, I left with something no one else in that room could carry: peace, not applause, not validation, not even justice, at least not the courtroom kind. Just the quiet knowledge that the truth had landed, where it was always meant to, and that no one could take it back. Weeks later, I stood in the living room of the Marble Hill estate. The sun filtered through stained glass windows, painting old wooden floors in warm amber. There were no voices echoing down the hall, no performance, just wind against ivy-covered brick, and the creak of a home finally exhaling. I didn't redecorate, not yet. I did something else. I reopened the Monroe Foundation, but not under that name. I called it the Ward House, a place where women could breathe, where they could sleep without checking locked doors 3 times, where they could start over without shame. I hired staff who knew what survival looked like. I planted roses Grandpa once said were too stubborn to die, and I didn't speak to Judith or Tyler again. They never reached out, not to fight, not to apologize. They disappeared in the same silence they once used against me. One afternoon, Langford visited. He didn't stay long, just long enough to hand me an envelope. He asked me to wait until you settled in. Inside was a photograph, me and Grandpa on the porch steps. I was 13. He had his arm around me. We were laughing, unfiltered, unperformed. Taped to the back was a yellowed sticky note in Grandpa's handwriting. She sees what others miss. I sat with that picture for a long time, not crying, not aching, just still. I didn't inherit an empire. I inherited the chance to end something, so that something better could begin, not for legacy, not for revenge, not for recognition, for peace, the kind that can't be bought, only chosen, and this time, I chose it. If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes in quiet strength.